Now, complaints over social housing have increased by over 300% during the last year. The sector is meant to provide housing which is affordable, but are living standards being put to one side? Well, I'm joined now by Susanna Mooner, who's the Secretary of the Social Housing Action Campaign. Very good morning to you, Susanna Mooner. So, a huge rise in complaints over the last year about social housing. In your experience, how common is it that social housing is below standard?
Yeah, we're seeing a huge number of cases that come to us because people are living in substandard accommodation. And we know that across the UK, about 3.5 million households are below standard. And I think there is a real stigma attached to people living in social housing, in that they are expected to be grateful regardless of what kind of condition the housing is in. So landlords feel quite able to ignore a lot of the complaints that come through. And unfortunately, we do have this really big enforcement gap at the moment in getting landlords to address it.
Well, yeah, and we're looking at pictures while we're talking to you of the accommodation of a tenant called Peter, who had 60 years in this council house, surrounded by sewage outside, leaks, causes kitchen ceiling to collapse, sewage inside the house as well, coming up through the plug hole, for example. I mean, a really appalling standard there of his accommodation. I mean, what are some of the worst examples you've seen?
Very similar to that, actually, where we've had people who have had sewage coming into their flat, not up through the pipes in one of the worst cases that we've had, but it was coming in through his balcony because there was spillage coming from another flat in the block. So very similar. And obviously, and you know, it's obvious from the film as well, that that is a real health hazard. I mean, we wouldn't allow animals, let alone people, to be living in these kind of conditions.
Well, yes, health hazard and mental health hazard as well, I think. But how much is this down to financial pressures on councils and housing associations? They say they've got increased borrowing costs. They will say they've got big bills to fix ageing stock. Also, they've got to keep up to date with the new fire safety issues. They've got to decarbonise homes as well. And they've also had a series of rent cuts and caps over the last decade that has meant that money is even more of a problem. Is that the main issue here, do you think?
Not in both cases. I think we have to separate out the conditions for councils from those for housing associations. Housing associations have a collective surplus of 4.4 billion. So this is, and obviously the majority of that will be with the big housing associations, which actually is where we see the worst of the conditions. So for housing associations, there is no excuse in terms of money. And also, although they talk about having had a rent cut, social housing, the cap has risen by 7 and 7.7% over the last couple of years. So there's not really been this drop in rents. For councils, the situation is slightly different. They are suffering from decades of cuts to their budgets, and around 100 councils in England alone are expected to declare bankruptcy over the next 5 years. This is a further 100 councils across England because, of course, some are already in receipt of emergency funding. So for them, they are having to prioritise, and unfortunately, sometimes even the most urgent needs are not making themselves felt in terms of the budget pressures. So I think there is a difference between councils and housing associations when we look at the condition of the housing. Certainly, we would say that housing associations have no excuse for keeping the kind of conditions that we are seeing in Shack.
Well, Susanna Mooner, really interesting to get your take on this. We appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Still to come here on